examined the girl with the missing bone. Nothing had happened to her since we saw her last. But something had changed in the village. The villagers brought the girl's cousin to Champlin to be examined. The boy was 19. The villagers told Champlin that the boy had been wounded 3 years before, while on duty with the self-defense unit. The self-defense unit is a sort of government-sponsored local militia made up of mostly small boys and old men. He had been hit by a Viet Cong grenade at the age of 16. Apparently, during our absence, the village elders had made up their minds. They said that Champlin and Lanui could take the boy to the hospital if they thought he could be helped, along with his cousin, the little girl.
He was hit by a hand grenade when he was on an operation with the People's Self-Defense Forces. He wounded in the head and the stomach at the same time, and when he was wounded in the head, he lost part of his right brain, so he lost function in the left side of his body, left hand, left leg. His father was killed several years ago when he was hit by artillery fire. Chúng tôi sẽ cố gắng giúp họ.
There was one moment of extreme hospitality. We asked the chief if we could spend the night in the village, mostly out of curiosity. He said yes without hesitation. You will be safe, he told us. If anyone comes in the night, the chief will be the first one they kill. We decided we had better get back to Quang Ngai before dark. Things seemed quiet enough that afternoon in Quang Ngai, although there must have been some action outside town. If it was not for the wounded soldier hobbling down the street with his bare legs and his companion carrying his pants, it would have seemed like peace. Except for that hint of the war, it was business as usual in Quang Ngai. People were out on the streets, going about their business, selling lottery tickets and black market cigarettes, and of course, counting their money, just like the end of any normal day. We took a table and sat down at a small sidewalk cafe, a legacy of the French. A little beggar boy approached our table, and that's how we met Lon. Dr. Champlin noticed him immediately. He was a special case. This boy's body was totally burned by phosphorus, or perhaps napalm. The boy didn't say. He didn't want to talk too much about himself. He told us that his name was Lon, that he lived 12 kilometers away with his grandmother, and that he walked here from the village every day to beg. Champlin told us Lon needed immediate help. There was nothing holding the boy's eyes in their sockets, and a sudden jolt might blind him. In fact, the boy was unable to hold his eyes shut, and that would certainly make him blind, eventually. Lon said he had no family except for his grandmother, so we went to see her in the village. According to Vietnamese law, we needed her permission to hospitalize the boy. On the way to the village, our interpreter chatted with the Vietnamese driver, then said to us in French, "This is the road to My Lai. Have you heard the story of My Lai?"
Ça, c'est la route on va à My Lai. Et tu as entendu dire l'histoire de My Lai?
Lon had neglected to tell us one thing about his grandmother. She was blind. The old woman said she didn't want to talk to foreigners at all. She was an old woman. She was blind, and she didn't want to live alone. All she had was Lon to take care of her, and she would not let us take him away. But all her neighbors came, one after the other, and told the old woman that they would take care of her, and that she should let the little boy come with us to the hospital to be cured. While Lon's grandmother thought it over, another woman started cursing the war in general. The men are fighting it, she said, but it's the women who are suffering.
Không bắn người ở đây, dễ sưng lắm rồi. Không cần...
Lon's grandmother finally agreed to let him go with us, and then went back into her hut. The little boy jumped into the car and said, "Let's get out of here before she changes her mind." Just before we left, a lady showed us a baby and said, "Here's another one you can take with you." We asked what she meant, and she said, "A foreign soldier made this baby. Take it back." She didn't seem to be very happy. The baby looked like it might be part Korean. So Lon left his grandmother and his village and began the trip to the hospital in Saigon. For the first time in his life, Lon was with other children like himself, scarred and disfigured children who did not look away. Lon became less self-conscious. In fact, he became an enthusiastic patient. The nurses loved him. They said he was up before other children and was always anxious to help with any little job that needed doing. Lon liked to make things with his hands, and he was very good at it, very delicate and sensitive. It was occupational therapy, of course, but something more than that, something traditional. Even in the midst of ugliness and war, the Vietnamese retained their love of beauty and nature. All this we observed about Lon. He still didn't talk about himself. Only through his admission form did we discover that he had an uncle in Saigon and a mother somewhere. He didn't know where. It takes some time to build up children's strength for surgery, but the two cousins from the village near Quang Ngai were just about ready for their operations. They were a little worried, not about themselves, but about their families. They had heard on the radio that a typhoon had caused considerable damage where they lived. When they learned that we were making a trip to Quang Ngai, they asked if we would take the letter with us. It took the boy a while to write the letter. The grenade had damaged his brain and he was half paralyzed. The little girl looked on. It was ironic. Two children from one family. One wounded by one side of this war, one by the other. And now, the typhoon, as if things weren't bad enough. The typhoon was over in Quang Ngai. Most of the streets were flooded, but the damage was not too severe. The people moved about, trying to get their businesses started again. We began to think that the reports had been exaggerated, that the storm had not been that bad. Then we got to paddy country, the lowlands, where almost everything was flooded. papers and the radio talked about damage estimates and hundreds dead. Well, what did that mean in Vietnam? 100 dead. Most of the houses were demolished by the storm. Families had no place to live, except in their boats. A few houses on higher ground escaped, but not many. There was no way of knowing how many people had been drowned. The survivors didn't want to talk about it. They had started to rebuild already, even before the water went down. Weathermen called the typhoon Esther. To the Vietnamese, it was this year's big storm, one more annual disaster to be survived. They have been accused of being fatalistic, but who wouldn't be fatalistic under these circumstances? With man and nature against you, there are not many alternatives. You can commit suicide or try to rebuild and survive. The pigs had drowned anyway, so they might just as well be butchered and eaten. We stopped at the refugee camp along the road, the first place we had visited. But this time, they didn't want to talk. They didn't say a word. But the children still seemed oblivious. It was just normal life for them. How many times had it happened? The people had started to rebuild here, too. There was not much left of the original camp, except for the children's pathetic laughter. A woman worked in the debris, gathering together what was left of the rice. Despite everything, they were managing to survive. They would find a way. A woman got a fire started for cooking, or maybe just for warmth. For some of the refugees, it had been this way all their lives. Lenui wanted to talk to Lan's grandmother again. There were some questions he wanted to ask, but we couldn't get through. The road was impassable. So we walked to the other village to deliver the children's letter. The boy's mother came to meet us to get the news of the two children. She was very embarrassed because she did not know how to read, and she was ashamed to reveal that fact, especially to foreigners. One of the men read it aloud. The two children were ready for their operations. Maybe they would be over by the time the letter was received, and they would be better. Most of the letter was full of questions. How bad was the storm?